Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Suranjali Seal, and like I always say, if you are somebody that loves literature and is all about literature, then this is the channel for you. In our video today, we're going to discuss Aristotle's Poetics. Now, it is an absolute must read when it comes to literary criticism as far as English literature is concerned. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So, when it comes to Aristotle's Poetics, what is usually stressed on and more generally talked about and highlighted is his theory of mimesis and also his what he says about tragedy and its component parts. Now, what I would want to do instead is actually refer to the text itself, because I think that there's so many things that he talks about in the text, the very important things. He's very detailed and very lucid about what he's trying to say, very crystal clear about what he's trying to say. So I just don't want to suddenly just talk about mimesis, or I just don't want to suddenly talk about tragedy. I would want to look at the text and, like chapter wise, see what he's trying to say. So first we'll try to understand and grasp whatever ideas he's trying to put forth like through his own writings. We'll look at what he has written. After that, we're going to discuss what mimesis is, what tragedy is. So with that being said, let's just begin with the first part. Okay, we can talk about the introduction. So in Poetics, okay, usually what Aristotle does in all of his other works, he actually describes, or kind of in the introduction, he tells us what he's talking about. Any chapter, he'll try sort of give you an overview of what the work is about. But in Poetics, he does not say that. He does not give any kind of introduction or overview or an idea of what he's trying to say. In Poetics, he directly begins with the work itself. In the introduction, he directly comes to the point, and then he tells us that, okay, this is what I'm going to talk about. He does not give a whole synopsis or a whole summary or a whole understanding. He does not say, in this work, I'm going to examine this. No. In this work, in the introduction, he does not give the notion of the forest. See, Aristotle usually presents a notion of the forest before he begins to look at the trees, but not in the Poetics. That is, he directly begins with the work in the introduction itself. He says, I'm going to deal with poetry's component parts. Now, what are these component parts? What is poetry? We'll understand once we start reading the work. Okay, so he does not give us a overview of what he's going to talk about. He directly begins with the work in the Poetics. Now, let's look at the introduction. Now, if you have your text, I would really appreciate it if you could refer to the text. I'll just read out. It's a very small line. He says that, I propose to treat of poetry in itself and of its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, to inquire into the structure of the plot as requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever else falls within the same inquiry. Following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. Now, what happens is, when you read it at one go, in one flow, it might seem a little confusing. You might not know what he's talking about. But actually, you have to understand this. In the Poetics, he does not give his... he says that, how do we approach the text? That's the first part. How do we approach the work? He says that we have to see how to approach. We are going to see here, we are going to look at poetry. We are going to treat poetry itself and its various kinds. That's the first. We have to look at poetry and its various kinds. Noting the essential quality of each. That is, poetry and its various kinds. We're looking at the quality of each. To inquire into the structure of the plot as requisite to a good poem. That is, we are going to look into what is the kind of plot we need in order, which is required for a good poem. How do we classify a good poem? What is the plot that is needed to actually classify a poem as being good? And he is actually dissecting and examining the constituent parts. So he's saying into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed. So he's looking at a poem, okay, and he's trying to dissect its parts. He's going to look at the component parts. He's going to look at the quality. He's going to look at the kinds. He's going to look at what is the criteria that makes a good poem. Then, and similarly, into whatever else falls within the same inquiry, whatever else is required, okay, that we need to know about poetry, that he's going to deal with in Poetics. Now, following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. So he's saying, okay, so that having been said, let us begin what we're going to talk about. Now see, here he's being descriptive, not perspective. I'll give you the example of this. Perspective is like you're trying to say that I think poetry is supposed to be like this. but descriptive is just describing what poetry is. So he's being descriptive, he's not being perspective, he's not trying to tell you that poetry should be this or should not be this. He's actually describing what poetry is, what are the kinds of poetry, what are its constituent parts, what is the requisite, that what are the things we need what are the things that qualify, okay, for a good poem to exist. What are the things that qualify that this is a good poem? What are the things that a poem has that gives it that stature that it's a good poem? Okay. Then he also he does not say what should or should not be. Like I said, he's describing what poetry is to us. General sense of what poetry is and how it works. So like I said, he's being descriptive. He's giving us a general idea of poetry is and how it works. So that's the introduction. Now he's going to talk about poetry as a species of imitation. So he says epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also, and dithyrambic poetry. Dithyrambic poetry is hymns, okay? In ancient Greece, they had hymns, and those hymns were known as dithyrambs. So dithyrambic poetry and the music of the flute and of the lyre in most of their forms are all in the general conception modes of imitation. So he's saying that the flute, songs, poetry, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, all of these are imitations. Okay, that's his first statement, that all of them are imitations. They differ, okay, from each other, however, okay, from one another in three respects. The medium, the objects, the manner or mode of imitation being in each case different. So he's saying that all of them are imitations. Epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, the flute, the music of the flute, the lyre, they're all imitations. They're imitating something, similar things. But how do they differ from each other? How can we pick out that, okay, this is poetry, epic poetry, this is tragedy? We can pick that out because they differ in the medium, that is, how are they, what medium do we employ, okay, in these in epic poetry, tragedy, what is the medium employed, okay, the medium of imitation. Object, what are the objects that we imitate, what do we imitate, and the manner of imitation or the mode of imitation, how do we imitate. Okay, so all of these three things, the medium of imitation, the objects of imitation, the manner of imitation or the mode of imitation, in each of these cases are different, and that's how we identify them. So I think this is like the introduction, you can like kind of consider it. So again, I'm saying he's describing what poetry is. He's not being perspective. He's not giving his opinion that this should be that, this should be this. No, he's just describing or attempting to look at poetry and its component parts and its various kinds. Okay, so he's going to dissect poetry now. Here, after this, moving forward, we're going to begin with the medium of imitation, then we're going to go to the object of imitation, and then we're going to go to the manner of imitation, which is the first 3 chapters of the Poetics. Okay, so let's move on further. Okay, so in this part, let's look at the medium of imitation, what he says. Okay, so I'll read out a few lines from the text and then we're going to analyze it. So for the medium of imitation, he says, for there are persons, there are people who, by conscious art or mere habit, imitate and represent various objects through the medium of. Okay, let's just handle this part. He's saying there are people who, by conscious art or mere habit, what do you mean by conscious art and mere habit? Okay, conscious art and mere habit imitate and represent various objects. How do we represent objects? Through conscious art or mere habit? What's the difference between the two? Conscious art is things that you cultivate. You're born, okay, but you just don't born and you become a professional dancer. You're born and you become a professional painter. You have to cultivate these arts. If you are born with a good voice, you have to cultivate that art of singing. Your voice, you have to actually practice and nurture your voice into perfection or into bettering yourself. So art, painting, the music of the lyre, the flute, which he talks about, these are through conscious art. Conscious art, that is, you have to cultivate them. And when you talk about mere habit, it's the habits that we have right from childhood. It's through conscious art or mere habit that we imitate and represent objects. Conscious art, we develop our skills, and then like maybe through painting we imitate life, we imitate a person, imitate things we see around us. Songs also, we imitate life, talk about emotions, all of that. And we imitate through mere habit. How? Right from when we are kids we actually imitate, right? We learn to talk, we learn to actually associate. This the association that we have right from kids, that we're able to identify things, is through imitation and mimicking. We actually mimic our parents. We try to learn language through mimicking, also through what we hear. Also, you'll see that when we're kids, our parents would say, how does a cat mew, or how does a dog bark, or how does a bee sound. We always mimic sounds like that right from when we are kids. That's how we associate. So by mere habit, by virtue of being human beings, this is what comes naturally to us. We'll see this point as we move forward in the poetics. But for now, just know that mere habit would mean that by our nature, by mere habit, we imitate. And conscious art is things that we cultivate, our skills that we cultivate, that we learn, okay, and better ourselves. So he's saying that by conscious art, there are people who by conscious art or by mere habit imitate and represent objects through the medium of. What is the medium employed by these people who actually, or by us in general, who actually imitate? We actually imitate using color and form, which would be painting. We paint to imitate life. We might imitate by the voice. We might employ or use the medium of our voice, which would be singing. Then we might use only rhythm, which can be dancing, language, or harmony, that is singly or combined. Singly, if we use only rhythm, it's employed in dance. But combined, if you take rhythm and language together, okay, if you combine them together, we get poetry. So he's saying either singly or combined, we use these different aspects. If we combine them or use them singly, we get all of these things that we're talking about: epic poetry, dithyrambic poetry, music of the flute and the lyre, everything we get. Okay, so these are the medium of imitation. So then he says that this is, and then if you read the first paragraph, okay, of this medium of imitation, he actually talks about this only, that in dancing rhythm is employed. If you consider flute and the lyre, harmony and rhythm are alone employed. So he describes these things. Then he goes on to say, and I've quoted it here because this is what he says. He says, people do indeed add the word maker or poet to the name of the meter, and speak of elegiac poets or epic, that is hexameter poets, as if it were not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them all indiscriminately to the name. So he's saying that what he's trying to say here is, people know, they associate a poet. When you say who is a poet, immediately don't you think in your mind that somebody who writes verses, somebody who actually is able to rhyme? I mean in a very layman's term, if you would agree with me, when we think of a poet, usually the very common thing that comes to our mind is the rhyming words, that you're able to compose verses and those verses rhyme. So there's a particular meter used. Meter over here is the rhythm or pattern of beats in a line of poetry. In a line of poetry, you have a beat that follows, okay, and that is the meter of the poem. So he's saying that we associate the word maker or a poet to these things, to the meter, the name of the meter, and speak of all of them, all of these poetry types, all of these kinds of poetry. We do not talk of what they're imitating, as if it was not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them. It is the verse that you're writing in verse, that is what entitles you to be a poet. So, the question over here arises also, and he talks about this also, that you will see that sometimes and he's saying that sometimes there are people who are writing of topics related to science, but they write it in verse. But is that considered to be poetry? Is that poetry? If I'm giving this just for example, suppose you have a law in science, and instead of writing in sentences the law, that this law states that, you write a beautiful verse, or you write the law in verse form. Is that still poetry? One would be from the science background and the other is a poet. So he says over here, and he mentions the name, and I'll tell you the names. He says that even when a treatise on medicine or natural science is brought out in verse, the name of poet is by custom given to the author because it's in verse. And he's saying, and yet Homer, that is, he composed verses, and Empedocles, okay, he's another person, have nothing in common. Like, you see, these laws in science and a verse that imitates life have nothing in common. Okay, so he's saying over here that it is not we actually associate what a poet is, who a poet is, to the way, to the verse, the way that they write the verse. If anything is written in verse, we say, okay, it's by a poet. But he's saying that there at times, even things that are written in verse, they don't match. One can be of this one can be from totally outside poetry's purview also. So now you'll have to know what is a verse. Okay, a verse is words are organized in a line, okay, in a metrical line, single metrical line, or a group of lines, which is stanzas. So the words that are arranged, it's not arranged in sentences, it's arranged in metrical lines. They have a rhythm to it. When you read poetry, you'll have that rhythm in the line. It's one line or a group of lines that make up stanzas. The stanza is a verse, a group of lines arranged in that rhythm, the metrical beats, the metrical lines. The one line, a group of lines together that form a stanza. That is a verse. And in prose, a group of words are written in sentences and together they form a paragraph. So in verses are written by poets, and paragraphs or prose is written by an author or a writer. So this is the difference. So again, I'll repeat. He says that people indeed sometimes associate the word maker or poet to the name of the meter. That is how a line of poetry, the beats that are arranged. Okay, that's how we actually associate, or we tag a poet by employing that meter. Okay, and speak of all of these poets as if it was not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them all indiscriminately to the name. So he's saying that it is not the imitation, but actually the verse that gives them the name. So what he's trying to actually highlight is that we have to stress on the imitation, the medium of imitation, what is being imitated. That you have to highlight in order to understand who a poet is, what poetry actually is. So we're going to look at the objects of imitation, and then we're going to look at the manner of imitation, then we'll understand it better. Now we're going to move on to chapter 2, which is object of imitation. Now this is pretty easy. He says that men in action. Okay, what since the objects of imitation, what are the objects of imitation? Are men in action. So what do we imitate? Medium of imitation, we can use language, we can use color and form, we can use rhythm, whatever. We use these to imitate what? What are the objects that we imitate? What are the objects that poets used to imitate? We imitate men in action. That is whatever we see around us. So again, if I take you back to the substance theory, he says that everything we see around us is composed of matter and form. So we see these things and we try to actually imitate them. We imitate men in action. So he's saying these men must be either of a higher or lower type. These men must be of a higher or a lower type. So higher, that is better than in real life, and lower as worse than in real life. So if you're imitating men of a higher if you're or of a higher type, that will be tragedy, and if you are employing men of a lower type, that will be comedy. So why is it that he says that tragedy is of a higher type? Why is tragedy of a higher type? Because it deals with, like, by definition, you'll learn it later when we reach the chapter on tragedy, that he says that it deals with serious, important, virtuous people. Okay, serious issues depicted on stage, and it impacts you so much that the impact is grave. You know, we know the word catharsis. So he talks about this in tragedy, that a tragedy deals with serious things. Comedy is just the opposite, right? So that is what he means, that people of a higher type. So, you know, we'll discuss this heavily when we'll do tragedy and its component parts in the next video. I'll dedicate one whole video to Aristotle's views on tragedy, okay? And another video on his views on imitation, that is mimesis, and how it contrasts with Plato's theory of imitation. We'll discuss that in a separate video. But for now, just know that he says, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the word catharsis. So he says that concentration of tragic plots in any tragedy, the concentration of plots, no, it heightens the impact on the audience. Like it helps you achieve catharsis. We'll talk about this later. We're not going to talk about this now. But just know that when you are watching any tragic play, the impact on you is so much that, and you take inspiration from that. So it's of a people of a higher type. You're so emotionally impacted by what they're showing you on stage, and it is not that you're laughing or you're ridiculing that. I'm giving this very easily. We'll discuss it heavily in tragedy. Okay, I'm giving an example. When you watch a tragedy, you don't laugh. You're actually shook by it. You're actually, the impact on the audience is a lot, and because the plot builds up that way, right, towards the end, no, there's like a closure that you get, and that gives you a lot of. I'm giving this very easily because catharsis is again another whole topic. We'll do it in the next video. But just understand this, that once you see the culmination of the events towards the end, no, you get the sense of, okay, this is the end. Okay, this is done. And when you watch that, no, the impact on you is very grave. That's why it's men of a higher type. But when you consider comedy, you laugh, right? Because there are people, sometimes they're very ridiculous people. Sometimes there are people who are in ridiculous situations and who are depicted. They're usually, he says that it's of a lower type. These are people of a lower type. And again, here also, you're happy that thank God that's not us. The difference lies in this fact that tragedies of a higher type impact on you is more grave, and comedies of a lower type, because you're actually laughing at whatever is happening on stage. These are characters who are they are very how will I say, very, I wouldn't say easy characters, but not so serious characters. Like, you cannot take them seriously. End goal is for you to laugh. So these are men of a lower type. So what happens is, Homer, okay, for example, makes men better than they are. Okay, so there's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of like trifles toward the ends. We get catharsis because the plot builds up that way, and then it heightens the impact on us when we are finally towards the end. And then he says that Cleophon is another person who depicts men as they are, like as realistically as possible if you can depict them, or you depict them as worse than they are in real life. You either depict them as better than they are in real life, which is in tragedy, worse than they are in real life, which is in comedy, or as they are in real life. That's how you have to depict these characters or imitate them. So he says comedy aims at representing men as worse, tragedy as better than in actual life. So this is his whole take on the object of imitation. What do we imitate? That is what we're talking about. Medium of imitation, he says that we can imitate using color and form, we can use the voice, we can use rhythm, language, harmony, singly or combined. Okay, this is what we use for as the medium of imitation. But when it comes to object of imitation, who do we imitate? We imitate men as better than they are, worse than they are, or as they are. So if it's men who are better than they are in real life, it's of a higher type, which is tragedy. If we are depicting men who are lower than they are in real life, then it is comedy. So I think that tragedy and comedy he again separately deals with in the chapters that are to come. We'll discuss that in detail. So for now, object of imitation, this is what you have to know. Now let's move on further. Okay, so guys, let's look at the third section. He says that it's the manner of imitation. There is still a third difference. That is what Aristotle says, and it is the manner in which each of these objects may be imitated. For the medium being the same and the objects being the same, the poet may imitate by narration, okay, or in his own person unchanged, or he may present all his characters as living and moving before us. Sounds complicated, but it's very, very easy. What is he saying? He's saying that we're done with the medium of imitation first. Second is the object of imitation. Now we're talking about the manner, the mode in which they're imitated. So he's saying that, just take for example, let's consider that the medium is the same. Let's consider that it's narration and it's rhythm. There's rhythm, okay, to it. So let's take poetry only. So it's rhythm and language. Language and rhythm together is poetry. So he says that suppose the medium is the same, for example, and the object is also the same. Say, let's take the theme. Let's just take, there might be a particular theme. Let's just say that the object is also the same. We're depicting life. It can be war, it can be a person, anything. Okay, the object is also the same, medium is also the same. The poet may imitate in different ways. How different ways? It can be in the form of narration, just like Homer does. Now, Homer in the Iliad and Odyssey also, he writes in the dialectic form. It is actually the traditional way of actually like seeing poetry. In if you have read this Iliad and the Odyssey, he's written in a rhythmic rhyme scheme, which is the dialectic hexameter. So it's written in verse. It's in the form of poetry only if you have read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, this is Homer. If you consider traditionally, like at home also in our country, we have the epics, Mahabharata and the Ramayana. They are also composed in verses, but they narrate a story, right? So what he's trying to say here, Aristotle, is a poet might actually use the mode of imitation is all the medium of imitation the same, which is of poetry, language, and rhythm, and the object also the same, say imitating us in our real life, okay, or it is of a higher type. Let's just consider. So he may imitate by narration, just like Homer does, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, where they actually imitate through narration, telling us a story. Or he says that in which case he can either take another personality as Homer does, or speak in his own person. Now, I'll give a different example for this. If you consider poetry only, speaking in his own person. If you have read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he is talking himself, right? Like when you read it, you'll feel like as if somebody is talking to you. So it's like a monologue. So that is also there. And he says, or he may present all his characters as living and moving before us. It can be the characters themselves talking, or it can be a dialogue between two characters. It like we see even in the Mahabharata, there are dialogues between two characters that are happening. But it can just be poetry. The medium can be the same, and the objects can be the same. The mode can be different. So, he's saying that it is these three, medium, object and mode, that help us actually understand what poetry is, because it employs all of this. Epic poetry, dithyrambic poetry, tragedy. This is the way it is imitated. So, these three things are the things you need to consider. Now, we have to go to the next chapter. Here, he talks about the origins. How probably poetry must have originated. Like I said, he's not trying to tell you that poetry is right or wrong. How should poetry be written? What should a good poem be? He's not saying all that. He's describing to us what he thinks poetry is. So he's saying poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. So he says that you don't have to really brainstorm and try to think that, okay, where did poetry originate from? He says that it's very close to our nature as human beings. He says first, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. And I just mentioned that just a while ago, that right from childhood, we imitate. Like we learn through imitation. We actually mimic our parents. You'll see when a child learns association of objects, when a child learns language through imitation, imitating the mother and the father or the parents. When you actually imitate them, listen to them, you try to imitate the words, that's how you first learn language. So he's saying that the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and the other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures. Like man is the most imitative of living creatures. That's what Aristotle says. Then he says that through imitation, he learns his earliest lessons, like I just mentioned, and no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. So he says that once you successfully learn how to imitate things, you're actually very, very happy. It gives you immense pleasure when you have successfully learned to imitate or imitated the object that you actually want to imitate. If you learn to imitate that, it gives you a lot of pleasure. I mean, you just think, okay, when you're dancing and you're depicting a story on stage, if you are successfully able to depict the story on stage and you're able to move your audience, doesn't that give you pleasure? If suppose you're drawing a portrait of somebody and you exactly are able to make the portrait of the person, doesn't that give you happiness? Doesn't it give the person happiness also? So he's saying that imitation is universal pleasure felt in things imitated. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience, he says. So, objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. So he's saying, like, if you consider tragedy, he's saying that things like tragedy in life, we actually view with pain. But when we see it on stage, we actually contemplate on it. We actually think about it. We actually give time to let it sink in, like we say. So he's saying that, you just think of movies only. If you consider those movies that cater to social awareness, if you see brutality taking place, if you see war taking place in the movies, you actually, it makes you think. Those the movies that are concerned with social issues, depicting social issues regarding women, regarding the world, regarding all the crimes that are happening in the world, when you watch that on the screen, it makes you think, it makes you contemplate. That's how it is. So he's saying that, objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity. When we see that depicted, I'm giving by today's example, if we see these social issues being depicted on stage, and when we see a complete tragedy, don't we say, what a movie you've made, oh my god, what a movie you've made. You're actually praising that tragedy being shown on the screen, but you're doing that because it actually gives you that feeling. The plot builds up, it deals with serious situations, it makes you think. So, that's the whole point. That's what Aristotle is saying. Such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. When you see these things on the stage, during Aristotle's time, and now also on stage and on the screen, it makes you contemplate, it makes you think, okay? So he's saying the cause of this again is that, I'm sorry, my laptop just gave some problem. 1 second. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay. So the cause of this again is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure. Okay. That's what he says. The cause of this again is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure, not only to philosophers, but to men in general, whose capacity, however, of learning is more limited. So here he's saying that as compared to philosophers, the learning capacity of men in general is more limited, but learning gives pleasure to both. To all men in general, to humankind in general, we like learning, okay? Then he says, thus, the reason why men enjoy seeing a likeness is that in contemplating it, they find themselves learning of inferring and saying perhaps, that is he. So he's saying that when we learn and thus the reason why men enjoying seeing a likeness, why we enjoy imitation, why we like it, why do we like mimicking, why do we like imitation, is because it helps us identify. That is he. You understand, when a child, you'll see, when the child first learns how to talk, the child is really happy with association. You'll see, and you'll see even the parents also, once the child is able to at least identify birds, it's like triumph for everyone, it's victory for everyone. We take general pleasure in learning, we take general pleasure in actually knowledge. And when we are able to actually identify things around us, in one way I also see this as as human beings, we're actually totally out of control. We have no control whatsoever in what's going to happen tomorrow. But we like that sense of being in control. We like that idea that we are in control. That's kind of a delusion, I believe, but then that's what we are. We are afraid of tomorrow. I'm telling you that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That kind of perplexes us, and we like to think that we're in control. That gives us a sense of security, I feel. So he's saying that when we are, this is off topic, but I'm just saying it. For example, that he's saying, that is he. When we are able to associate that, okay, this is the thing we're talking about, it gives us peace. It gives us happiness when we are able to associate the things that we're talking about. So he's saying that learning or inferring and saying perhaps, that it's nice when we contemplate and we're able to associate with the thing that we're imitating. So if we can say, okay, that's a bird. Okay, this is a thing. That is a thing. Whenever we say that, it gives us pleasure. Okay, so this is what he's saying. Then he's saying imitation then is one instinct of our nature. Imitation has been in our nature itself. That's the origin. That's where poetry springs from. Okay, so we've already discussed comedy just a while back, so this should be really, really easy to understand. Comedy, and I've given this in quotes, that means it has literally been taken from Poetics itself. So this is what Aristotle says about comedy. Comedy is, as we have said, an imitation of characters of a lower type, not, however, in the full sense of the word bad. The ludicrous being merely a subdivision of the ugly, it consists in some defect or ugliness which is not painful or destructive. So he's saying that this character or this comedy, this character of a lower type, is not evil, is not bad. It's a subdivision of the ugly. And what he means by ugly over here is that, it's some defect, a flaw, or an issue with the character that makes this character laughable or funny. but the character is not evil. He's not inherently a bad person. Okay, so he says, for Aristotle, comedy represents human beings as worse than they are. That's what he says, that comedy represents people as worse than they are, characters of a lower type. But Aristotle notes that comic characters are not necessarily evil, just ridiculous and laughable. So I think this is clear. Now we come to the term mimesis. I think that before we dedicate one whole video to mimesis, I think I'll just give you a few points, because this is what we've already talked about. We've already talked about it in discussing whatever we've discussed so far. So the term mimesis can be roughly translated as imitation. So we've been talking about imitation all this while. We've been talking about the object, the manner, the medium of imitation. So he says, what is imitation? Okay. Mimesis. What is mimesis? It is imitation. Now, we might say that something is mimetic if it is not and does not pretend to be the real thing. That is, we have a real thing, and whatever is being imitated, okay, something, we call it mimetic when it does not pretend to be the real thing. Like something that is trying to copy something else. It does not say, I am the real thing. The whatever is being copied accepts the fact that it's copying something. Like if a painter is painting, the painter does not say that I am the creator of the chair. No, he says that it's a painting of a chair. The painting of a chair is not the real thing. So it does not pretend to be the real thing. A painting of a chair is not a chair, like I said. Poetry is imitative in that it describes events in the real world without pretending to be these events. That is, poetry is mimetic or imitative because it describes events in the real world without pretending to be these events. For example, if I write today about love, a poetry about love, and I say that Cupid came in my dreams and shot me in my heart and then I fell in love. I'm just giving an example. If I write poetry like that, it doesn't actually mean that it actually happened. I'm not pretending that these events have actually taken place, but they can be related to the real world. Like the act of falling in love is related to the real world, but the way I'm describing it, I'm not like really saying that, okay, this is exactly what happens. I'm not pretending that this is an actual event. I'm actually telling you a story, but they resemble the real world. Like falling in love happens to most people in this world who are lucky enough to fall in love, and you're actually taking that event and then you're telling a story without pretending to be the event itself. Like, you're not saying this is exactly what happened. So poetry is imitative, that it describes events in the real world, whatever is happening around us. We talk about that only in poetry without pretending to be these events. When we're writing in poetry, we do not claim that these events are exactly true. We do not claim and say that, yeah, these are the events. We take inspiration from the real world and then we write poetry, right? And we depict the real world also, whatever things we see, whatever feelings we feel, we actually describe that through poetry. So that's what he means. What is important? So if it's not exactly represented, if it is not depicting, if it's not pretending to be the thing, what is important then? What is the use of poetry, or why is poetry then important? So Aristotle, it is important in that, in some sense, they could have taken place. Like, you take inspiration from the real world, you weave your own thoughts into it, and you create situations that could have taken place. That is what is important for Aristotle. So for Plato, if you'll see, it's just mere imitation. He says that poetry is twice removed from reality. He banned poets from his republic, okay? But Aristotle says that in some sense you're actually looking at the world around you and you're inspired by that. You're inspired by the world and you're describing events. You're not pretending to be the event itself. You have just described the events that are taking place in the real world, but you don't claim to be the original. You just take inspiration from the real world, weave your magic into it. And what is important is that they could have taken place. I mean, I could have actually dreamt that Cupid actually came and shot me in my heart and then I fell in love. I could have dreamt, I could have dreamt it could have taken place, even if it hasn't taken place now, like I haven't dreamt like that now, it might take place. So, what is important, that in some sense they could have taken place. Aristotle claims that we are naturally imitative creatures and learn from imitation, and so we are naturally drawn to tragedy and other mimetic arts. Like I said, when we watch those videos catering to social issues, we are immediately like, what a movie, what a documentary this is. I mean, they're showing pathetic scenes, they're showing sad scenes, they're showing very critical issues that are taking place in the society, but we actually take pleasure. Catharsis is that, like that pain that gives you a lot of pleasure at the end. Okay, so what is happening is you actually say that what a movie it was, what a play it was, because it stirs your soul, because you're stirred and you're actually, it affects you. So we are naturally drawn to tragedy and other mimetic arts. That's what Aristotle says, naturally drawn. That is right from birth we go for imitation, right? So he's saying that mimesis is natural, it naturally comes, or imitation naturally comes to human beings. So this is all that we've covered just now. This is his idea of mimesis. There's more dimensions to it, more ideas to it. I'll dedicate a separate video to it. And with this, we're done with part 1 of this video. I sincerely hope that this video has been helpful for you. I really hope that whatever we've discussed so far is clear. I feel that a detailed understanding of poetics is crucial before we actually talk about mimesis and tragedy and etc., whatever he talks about in the poetics. So that's why I made it a little lengthy, but I really sincerely hope that it has been helpful. And if it has, then please don't forget to like the video, share the video, and subscribe to my channel for similar content. I really want to thank all of you for the constant support that you've been showing me. It means a lot to me, and I sincerely mean it. This is a really fun-filled and exciting adventure and journey that we're taking together into deciphering what English literature is all about, and I'm thoroughly excited. I'm really grateful and thankful for all of you for joining me and accompanying me in this journey that we're taking together. Having said that, we are going to actually move on to part 2 of this video. This was part 1. We dedicated it to an overall understanding to the introduction and his idea of imitation. In the second part, we're going to talk about tragedy and its component parts. And then in the third section, we're going to talk about his theory of mimesis and contrast that with Plato's theory of imitation. And with that, we'll be done with Aristotle in totality. So till we meet again, guys, I really hope that you take care of yourself, stay healthy and stay happy. See you in the next one.